Hey everybody, welcome back. This is DS Yvonne at reprogrammingmind.com, and today we're going to look at the Dr. Joe Dispenza book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, and we're in part 2 now, and this is chapter 7, and it's called The Gap. And I think of all the chapters in this book, this one is probably my favorite. And I say that because in this chapter, Joe Dispenza is actually quite vulnerable. He talks about times where he's feeling not too happy in his life, and he was talking about after his movie, he was doing talks all over the world, and yet after his talks, he would go back to his room or his couch, and he would feel kind of down and out. And the reason being was because he was noticing that the person that he was projecting out into the world and on his speech tours and from his movie was quite different than the person that he really was. And so he had felt somewhat disenchanted with himself and his life. And I thought by him revealing that, I thought that was, well, in a sense, quite appealing. And I think that it was that which prompted him to write this book about breaking the habit of being yourself. I'm going to quote him here. He said, "My identity had become the people I talked to, the cities I visited, the things I did while I was traveling, and the experiences I needed in order to reaffirm myself as this person called Joe Dispenza. And when I wasn't around anyone who could help me recall this personality that the world might know as me, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. In fact, I saw that all of my perceived happiness was really just a reaction to stimuli in the external world that made me feel certain ways. I then understood that I was totally addicted to my environment, and I was dependent on external cues to reinforce my emotional addiction." And then he puts this diagram up to kind of illustrate what he means by this. And by this, he puts up these two hands. And so this top hand is how we appear. This is the identity that we project to the outer environment. This is who we think we are. This is what he calls the facade. And then this bottom hand is who we really are, how we feel and how we are on the inside. And he says this gap comes from developing these memorized addictive emotional states such as guilt, anger, shame, fear, anxiety, judgment, depression, self-importance, or hatred. And that's where this gap comes from. And so as an identity, we become attached to our external world by identifying with everyone and everything in order to remind us of how we want to project ourselves to the world. So how we appear becomes the facade of the personality, which relies on the external world to remember who it is as a somebody. And then our identity is completely attached to the environment. So in other words, I'm a boss, or I'm a mother, or I'm an entrepreneur, right? I own these cars. I know these people. I can do these things. I've had these experiences. I work for this company. I am successful. And it's who we think we are in relation to everything around us and everything outside of us. But that's different from who we are and how we feel without that stimulation of that outer reality. It's almost like we have this preoccupation with thoughts of not having the right body type in order to look a certain way, or having a sense of inadequacy due to like parents' insistence on perfectionism and achievement at all costs, or perhaps feelings of shame and anger about a failed marriage. Okay, and so all those feelings, this is who we truly are, this real self hiding behind the image that we are projecting. And we can't face exposing that self to the world, so we pretend to be someone else. We create a set of memorized automatic programs that work to cover the vulnerable parts of us. So the way I see it, it's almost like, we'll have these experiences in life, I'm gaining weight, or I'm losing hair, or I don't have enough money, or I don't, I haven't been able to get over that trauma that I've faced in the past. And here he says, let's face it, we have all been branded by emotionally charged events. And as we mentally reviewed the experience repeatedly, over and over, the body began to relive that event over and over just by thought alone. Right? So our life experiences end up defining our identity, and staying busy keeps these unwanted emotions at bay. Now, when this really becomes brought to the forefront is when we reach like our mid-30s or 40s, when the personality is complete, right? We've experienced much of what life has to offer, and as a result, we can pretty much anticipate the outcome of most experiences, right? We already know how things are going to turn out pretty much. I mean, we've had several good and bad relationships. We've competed in business or settled into our career. We've suffered loss and encountered success, or we know what we like and dislike, and we know the nuances of life. And since we can predict the likely emotions ahead of an actual experience, we determine whether we want to experience that known event before it actually occurs. And then this is where things get somewhat problematic, right? Because we can predict the feelings that most events will bring. We already know what will make our feelings about who we really are go away. However, when we reach midlife, nothing can completely take away that feeling of emptiness. So, for instance, your environment, which you may have relied on so heavily to remove your pain or guilt or suffering, is no longer taking away those feelings. And so, this is the midlife crisis that most people know about. And some try really hard to make buried feelings stay buried by diving further into their external world, right? They buy a new sports car, or perhaps get plastic surgery, or they get a new boat, or they go on a vacation, or they join a new social club, or they redecorate their house, or perhaps even move entirely. And so when we're trying to escape this emptiness, or when we're running from any emotion whatsoever that is painful, it's because to look at it is too uncomfortable. And so when the feeling starts to get a bit out of control, most people will turn on the TV or surf the internet or text someone or play video games or find some kind of distraction to take themselves away from that. And then by doing that, we kind of alter our emotions. We can do this so many times that, again, that becomes the go-to place to be able to feel better. And yet when we keep that diversion up, guess what happens? We end up becoming more dependent on something outside of us to change our internal state. But eventually we run out of these things, right? In a sense, like if it's a shopping spree that makes us feel good, then next thing you know, instead of spending $100, it's 500, then 1,000, then 5,000. Right? There's no ceiling on that. If we keep using external things, maybe it's sexual conquest, maybe it's alcoholism, maybe it's gambling. It's like that bar keeps being elevated more and more and more because we're trying to fill something that can't be filled from the outside. And after enough times of kind of banging our heads against the wall, of trying to kind of compete with ourselves in order to raise those elevated emotions, to get away from some kind of past pain, eventually we come to see that our futile attempt to maintain an ideal for others is really a strategy to make sure that these impending feelings we've been running from, they never capture us. We can't keep juggling this forever. And so instead of buying a bigger TV or the latest gadget, right, some people just stop running from the feeling that they've been trying to keep from themselves, and then they face it head on and intently look at it. And then when this happens, the individual begins to wake up, right? It's almost like people become inspired or they change either from inspiration or desperation. And then when that happens, that's when we've got to be honest with ourselves and who we really are. And that's also when we'll stop putting energy towards things that aren't really helping us. And we'll stop putting energy towards maintaining these illusory images of ourselves. So eventually a person might reach a state where maybe in their marriage they'll say, you know what, it doesn't matter if I don't make you happy any longer. And they might be saying stuff like, I'm through obsessing about how I look or what other people think about me. I'm finished living for everyone else. I want to be free from these chains. And this is a profound moment in a person's life. This is like the soul is waking up and nudging you or me or ourselves to tell the truth about who we really are. In other words, finding a way to just decide that that lie is over. And having that realization is not everything, of course. There's got to be more to it than that. And that more part is being able to change your energy. And this is where Dr. Joe Dispenza says, when it comes to change, our energy is connected to everything that we've had an experience with in our outer world. So when we break the addiction of emotion that we've memorized, or when we tell the truth about who we really are, well, doing that takes some real energy, just as it takes energy to separate two atoms of oxygen that are bonded together. It takes energy to break the bonds with the people also in our lives. And so this is what breaking the habit of being yourself is about. It's being able to detach from those emotions from the past that you might not have confronted from way back when. So for instance, if you had a certain experience from 50 years ago that marked you as insecure or weak, and you felt that way about yourself ever since, then in a sense you've stopped growing emotionally 50 years ago. Now, if the soul's purpose is to learn from experience and gain wisdom, but you've stayed stuck in that particular emotion, then you've never really turned that experience into a lesson. You didn't transcend that emotion and exchange it for any kind of understanding. And so while that feeling still anchors your mind and body to those past events, you're never really free to move into the future. And then if a similar experience shows up in your present life, well, then that event will trigger the same emotion that you will act as that person that you were 50 years ago. Now, most people who don't know how to be able to change those feelings or to make transformation in general, they just wonder how can they make this feeling go away. And then if the novelty of accumulating new things wears off and stops working, then what? Well, okay, then they start looking to bigger things, right? So perhaps drugs, right? So if they think if I take a drug or drink enough alcohol, then that's going to make that feeling go away. Maybe that external thing will produce an internal chemical change and cause you to feel great. But again, whatever that addiction is, people are still thinking that some external thing is going to take that internal feeling away. Okay, so here's the deal. So if we wait for anything outside of us to make us happy, then we're not following the quantum law, right? We are relying on the outer to change the inner. And if we are thinking that, oh, once we have the wealth to buy more things, well, then we will be overjoyed. Well, we've got it backwards. We have to become happy before our abundance shows up. And then I like this sentence here where Dr. Joe Dispenza says, true happiness has nothing to do with pleasure, because the reliance on feeling good from such intensely stimulating things only moves us further from real joy. So how do we get rid of this kind of gnawing feeling that we're not good enough, or that there's some kind of emotion from the past that's kind of preventing us from really stepping into the greatness of who you really are? And this is where Dr. Joe Dispenza talks about his meditation. And he says, you can change this in the privacy of your own home and your own mind, and you can work on extinguishing negative aspects of self and replacing those characteristics, or at least metaphorically cutting way back on the role they play and allowing them only in an occasional brief appearance with more positive and productive ones. So just to use a metaphor here, I would say it's kind of like pulling out weeds and planting flowers. Okay, so this is where you got to be thinking about forgetting about past events and validating those emotions you've memorized that have become part of your personality, right? Because your problems will never be resolved by analyzing them while you're still caught up in the emotions of the past. Looking at the experience or reliving the event that created that problem in the first place will only bring up the old emotions and a reason to feel the same way. And when you try to figure out your life within that same consciousness that created it, you will analyze your life away and excuse yourself from ever changing. Right? So instead, we should be unmemorizing our self-limiting emotions, because a memory without the emotional charge is called wisdom. So if we take care of unmemorizing that emotional state or eliminating it to the best of our ability, then we gain the freedom to live and think and act independent of the restraints or constraints of that feeling. Now, I want to give an example here of this. So let's say a person had a breakup or a divorce and they've not really been able to get over it. Perhaps they just felt like it shattered their world, and now they look at all relationships as a thing to avoid. Then, in a sense, they're just replaying that broken relationship over and over and over. But if they were able to unlearn or unmemorize the emotions related to relationships, in other words, if they stopped their limbic system, which had learned, linked, and stored negative associations towards relationships, then it opens up the room to be able to create a new relationship and have newfound happiness within themselves by getting rid of that old baggage. And by doing that, then you're closing and even eliminating the gap between who you are and who we present ourselves to the world to be. And of course, this is one of the greatest challenges in life. Whether we term this as living authentically or conquering ourselves or having people get us or accept us for who we are, this is something that most of us desire, right? Changing and closing that gap, and doing so comes from within. So for whatever reason that you're looking to be doing that, whether it is from inspiration because you've got some kind of big fat hairy goal that you're moving towards, or it's from perhaps desperation, right, being in a situation or a life where you're not really feeling good about it anymore and you've just had enough, or you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? So either way, that opportunity is there for you to be able to make that transformation. We can learn and change in a state of pain and suffering, or we can do so in a state of joy and inspiration. We don't have to wait until we are so uncomfortable that we feel forced to move out of our resting state. Now, one of the key concepts for being able to be breaking the habit of being yourself is to be able to have that meta position or that metacognition or being able to see yourself from the outside. Right? So, in other words, being able to have that self awareness or the skill of self observation. Now, the reason that's important is because in the meditation that Joe Dispenza has, is one of the things in that script is he talks about being able to step outside of your old personality and leaving it behind, right? So being able to have that awareness of how you are and then understanding what it would be like to kind of float out of your body. Okay, then when you can do that, you can kind of shed the skin of that whole old identity that was holding you back, that might have been tethered to those old emotions that might have been keeping you back and holding on to the past. Because it's like Einstein says, right? You can't solve a problem with the same level of thinking that created that problem. So, by being able to have that observer effect, by being able to step out of your body, then it enables you to be more solution based and to be able to step out of that old world and into a kind of a new realm or a new state of being, right? That's completely unattached to whatever was happening in the past that you're looking to be moving away from. And one of the metaphors that Dr. Joe Dispenza uses is about saying, think about your old self and how, like, imagine you're in a room, kind of like in that trash compactor scene in Star Wars, where the walls are closing in, both your arms outstretched. All that energy is required to push, 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 push. But if you were to step out of that room and then just kind of let those walls close, then that's okay. Right? You've stepped out of that gap. You no longer have to be wasting all that energy resisting and fighting to be able to fight what was going on. Instead, you can step out of that and step into a whole new realm of consciousness. And then when you do that, then in a sense, you're liberating the body emotionally. You're closing that gap. And then when we close the gap, we release the energy that was once used to produce it. And then with that energy, we now have the raw material we can use to create a new life. And the side effect of this phenomenon is a release of energy in the form of a stored emotion in the body. So once the mind of that emotion is liberated from the body, energy is freed up into the quantum field for you to use as a creator. Now, another side effect of breaking the bonds of your emotional addictions is that this release of energy is like a healthy shot of some kind of ambrosia or a wonderful elixir. Not only are you energized, but you feel something you likely haven't felt in quite a while, perhaps joy, right? So when you liberate the body from the chains of an emotional dependency, you will feel uplifted and inspired. And the example he gives here is like when you go on a long car trip or a long road trip or perhaps even a long flight. And then when the trip is over, you get out and then, you can stretch your arms and your legs and feel like a human being again. So when you liken that type of experience to understanding what it's like to be feeling, to be moving out of the past, well, then you can set your sights on that new future. And this is where Dr. Joe Dispenza says, ask yourself, what energy from past experiences in the form of limited emotions am I holding on to that reinforces my past identity and emotionally attaches me to my current circumstances? Could I use this same energy and transform it into an elevated state from which to create a new and different outcome? And that's what the meditation is good for, because meditating will help you peel away some of the layers, remove some of the masks that you've worn. And both of those things have blocked the flow of that grand intelligence within you. Then, as you remove the veils that block the flow of this intelligence, then you become more like it. You become more loving, more giving, more conscious, more willful, because that is its mind, right? The gap closes. And then at that stage, you feel happy and whole. And you no longer rely on the external world to define you. The elevated emotions you are feeling are unconditional, right? They're not attached to the trapments of the outside world. You are happy and feel inspired just because of who you are. You no longer live in that state of lack or want. And the reason this is fantastic is because, well, most people try to create in a state of lack or unworthiness or separation or some other limited emotion rather than from a state of gratitude or enthusiasm or wholeness. But they might have had a challenge being able to feel that way because they were held back, right? So when you can let go of that, then it really enables you to kind of step up into that whole new realm of consciousness. And the benefit of that is that that's when the field responds most favorably to you. And all of this starts with recognizing that that gap exists and meditating on the negative emotional states that have produced that gap and had perhaps dominated your personality. So, unless you're prepared to look closely at yourself and assess your propensities with honesty, then you will forever be mired in some past event and the negative emotions that it produced. And this is where he says you've got to see it and understand it and release it and create with the energy available to you by taking the mind out of the body and releasing it into the field. Now, for Dr. Joe Dispenza, when he was going through his own personal transformation of breaking the habit of himself, he was saying that he sat alone this one morning and he felt his heart beating. And he started thinking about who was beating his heart. And he says that he realized in one instant that he had distanced himself from this innate intelligence. And so he decided to close his eyes and put all of his attention on it. And he admitted who he had been and what he'd been hiding and how unhappy he was. And he says that's when he began to surrender to some aspects of himself to a greater mind. And then he decided he no longer wanted to live based on that same personality of trying to please everyone. So he next observed his unconscious behaviors and thoughts and feelings that had reinforced his old self and reviewed them until they became familiar to him. And then he thought about who he did want to be as this new personality until he became it. And then he says he suddenly began to feel this sense of joy. And so once he got this taste of it, or this newfound sense of self, that's when he retreated for about 6 months. He didn't tour, he didn't do any interviews or anything. Just for 6 months, he just even left his clinical practice to some degree. He says that he didn't want to lecture again, and he just wanted to take time for his own meditations to make that true change in his life, because he wanted to have joy from within and not from the outside, not from without. And he says that he had meditated every day, looking at those unwanted emotions, and one by one began to unmemorize them through this meditative process of unlearning and relearning. And he says he worked on this for months to change himself, piece by piece, dismantling that old identity and breaking the habit of being himself. And I want to quote Dr. Joe Dispenza here, because at the end of this chapter he says, you must become very clear about what you're doing and how you're thinking and how you're living and how you're feeling and how you're being, to the point that it isn't you. And you don't want to be it any longer. And that shift has to reach you on a gut level. It's kind of like when a person has reached rock bottom, or when they've finally decided that enough's enough. That's when a person really kind of steps up and decides to really make their own changes for themselves. And that's where this chapter ends, okay? So that's the end of chapter 7. And like I said, this was probably my favorite chapter because of how vulnerable Dr. Joe Dispenza is, and showing how he was able to discover that he didn't really like the way he was. He didn't like the way he was showing up in the world. I mean, yeah, it's nice to be in the movies and lecturing and doing the tours and having clients, but at the end of the day, if he's not happy, or if you're not happy, or if I'm not happy, then it doesn't really matter what we do in the outside world, because, I mean, it's like that old saying, no matter where you go, there you are. So at the end of the day, we've got to be happy with ourselves and who we are. All right, so in the next chapter, we'll get into chapter 8, which is about meditation and demystifying the mystical. We'll be sharing that with you in the future video. All right, so thank you so much for your time. I look forward to sharing more with you then. And for everybody that's been leaving comments and thumbs ups and thumbs down, I do appreciate all of that engagement. And I look forward to sharing more with you in the future. This is DS Yvonne at reprogrammingmind.com. Bye for now.